"I can't have a child," a fat girl said in tears, her voice lost in the storm. Cast out by her own kin, she fled into the frozen mountains, ready to die in the snow. But a rough mountain man found her, half frozen, trembling and alone, and carried her back to his lonely cabin. He thought he was saving her life. He didn't know she'd save his soul. As the snow trapped them together, whispers of old wounds rose with the firelight. His dead wife, her broken faith, both hearts too scarred to believe in miracles. But when the lawman rode up demanding proof of a family, everything changed. A desperate marriage, a spark of hope, and a miracle that no doctor could explain. Now, as the town gossips and the railroad men close in, can two broken souls, one who swore she'd never bear a child, and one who swore he'd never love again, find redemption in the miracle the mountains gave them? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The bitter January wind howled through the pines, whipping Camilla's thin shawl as tears froze on her cheeks. The words from the church social still rang in her ears, sharp as icicles. No children at her age? Surely the good Lord has his reasons. What use is a woman who can't give her husband sons? Poor thing, better off alone than bringing such burden to a marriage. Her father's elderly mule picked its way through deepening snow, each step uncertain in the gathering dark. Camilla hadn't planned where to go when she fled the meeting house. She just knew she couldn't bear another moment of those whispers, those pitying looks that cut deeper than the cold. The old timepiece in her pocket, her mother's last gift, showed nearly 8 o'clock. The temperature was dropping fast as night settled over the Colorado mountains. Camilla knew she should turn back toward Larkspur, but shame burned hotter than reason. 26 years old, unmarried, and now openly branded as barren. There would be no recovering from such scandal in a town that small. "Just a little further," she whispered, more to herself than the laboring mule. "We'll find somewhere to rest, then figure things out come morning." But the winter bare branches offered no shelter, and the wind only grew fiercer as they climbed higher into the timberline. Snow began falling in earnest, thick flakes that quickly covered the mule's ears and Camilla's shoulders. Her hands, red and stiff on the reins, had lost most feeling. The mule stumbled on a snow-hidden root, pitching forward with a startled bray. Camilla felt herself falling, too numb to properly brace for impact. She hit the frozen ground hard, the shock driving what little air remained from her lungs. By the time she managed to stand, the mule had already disappeared into the swirling white darkness. "Come back," she called weakly, but her voice was swallowed by the wind. Dizzy from the fall and half-frozen, Camilla staggered forward. She had no idea which direction led to town anymore. The familiar mountains had become a maze of identical white slopes and black tree trunks. Her grandmother's teachings echoed in her mind. Find running water, follow it downstream to civilization. Through the snow-muffled night, she thought she heard the faint music of moving water. Camilla turned toward the sound, forcing her legs to keep moving, though they felt like lead. The creek, when she finally reached it, was mostly frozen. Only a thin ribbon of black water remained visible between the ice-crusted banks. Camilla's legs gave out beside it. She slumped against a snow-covered log, no longer able to feel her feet or hands. Even the bitter cold seemed to be fading now, replaced by a dangerous warmth that tempted her to close her eyes. "Lord," she prayed through blue-tinged lips, "I know I ain't been what I should, failed at being a proper woman, bringing shame to my family name, but please, please don't let it end like this." Her consciousness was slipping away when she heard it, the crunch of boots on snow, steady and sure. A shadow fell across her face, broad-shouldered and tall against the starlit snow. A man's voice, rough as pine bark, muttered words that barely reached her fading senses. "Lord help me, she's near gone." Strong arms lifted her, and Camilla caught a glimpse of a bearded face before darkness took her completely. The last thing she felt was being cradled against a solid chest, the steady thud of a heartbeat beneath layers of wool and buckskin. Benjamin Creed hadn't planned on finding anyone in his territory tonight, least of all a half-frozen woman. He'd only left his cabin to check his trap lines before the storm got worse. Now here he was, carrying a stranger through knee-deep snow, her skin cold as ice against his neck where her head rested. "Ain't right," he grumbled to himself as he fought his way through the drifts. "Fool woman riding out in weather like this. Might have died if I hadn't." He cut the thought short, unwilling to consider that possibility. His cabin appeared through the trees, a solid shadow against the white world. Smoke still rose from the chimney. Thank Providence he'd banked the fire well before leaving. Benjamin shouldered open the door, ducking to keep from hitting the woman's head on the frame. The cabin's single room was sparse but orderly. A fire burned low in the stone hearth, and a narrow bed stood in one corner, its quilt neat and tucked. Benjamin laid his burden there gently, noting how pale her face looked in the firelight. Working quickly, he built up the fire until flames roared up the chimney. "Gotta get you warm," he muttered, more to break the heavy silence than to communicate with his unconscious guest. He pulled off her snow-crusted shawl and outer dress, leaving her in her chemise and petticoats. His own mother's voice echoed in his memory, lecturing about propriety, but there was no time for such concerns. Cold could kill faster than scandal. He covered her with every blanket he owned, then set water to heat on the cook stove. His wife's old herb chest still sat in its place by the hearth, though he hadn't opened it in the 3 years since her passing. Benjamin's hands shook slightly as he lifted the lid, but he forced himself to focus on the task. The woman needed help, and Sarah had taught him enough about healing before she died. "Willow bark for the fever that's coming," he said aloud, measuring dried bark into a cup. "Yarrow to warm the blood." The familiar motions were almost like a prayer, remembering Sarah's gentle hands showing him each herb's purpose. The woman on the bed stirred slightly, a soft moan escaping her blue-tinged lips. Benjamin saw her eyelids flutter but remain closed. He touched her cheek carefully, still dangerously cold. Without letting himself think too hard about it, he shed his coat and boots, then slipped under the blankets beside her, careful to keep a proper distance while sharing his warmth. "Don't you die on me," he whispered gruffly. "Had enough of death in these mountains." Hours passed like molasses in winter. Benjamin dozed fitfully, waking often to check his patient's breathing and add wood to the fire. Sometime past midnight, her shivering finally began. A good sign, though it looked painful. Her color slowly improved from deathly white to merely pale. Near dawn, she spoke for the first time, though her eyes remained closed. "I'm sorry," she mumbled. "So sorry. Please don't send me away." "Hush now," Benjamin answered awkwardly, not used to offering comfort after so long alone. "You're safe here." He was surprised to find he meant it. His cabin had been a fortress of solitude for 3 years, a place to nurse his grief and guilt over Sarah's death. Now, watching this stranger fight her way back from the edge of freezing, he felt something shift inside his carefully maintained walls. Like spring ice breaking up on the creek, it was both frightening and somehow right. When true dawn finally painted the cabin's window with pale light, Benjamin carefully extracted himself from the bed. His patient's breathing was steady now, her skin warm to the touch. She would live, though recovery would take time. He had no idea who she was, or what had driven her out into such weather. But those questions could wait. For now he had a pot of coffee to brew and preparations to make. Somehow he knew his life of chosen isolation had just changed irreversibly. As he stoked the morning fire, Benjamin found himself doing something he hadn't done since Sarah died. He prayed not out of duty or habit, but with real feeling. "Lord," he whispered, watching his unconscious guest's peaceful face, "I reckon you got your reasons for sending her here. Help me do right by her, whatever comes next." Benjamin carried Camilla through the deepening snow, his boots crunching a path toward the warm glow of his cabin windows. The wind howled fiercer now, driving ice-sharp flakes against them as the promised blizzard began to descend in earnest. He shouldered open the heavy pine door, ducking to protect his unconscious burden from the low frame. Inside, the single room glowed with banked firelight. Benjamin laid Camilla gently on his narrow bed, noting how her face remained pale as milk despite the cabin's warmth. He worked quickly, building up the fire until flames roared up the stone chimney. Heat soon filled the space, making the rough-hewn logs gleam golden in the dancing light. "Gotta get your blood moving," he muttered, taking her cold hands in his calloused ones. He rubbed them carefully, watching color slowly return to her fingertips. It felt strange touching another person after so long alone, but necessity overcame his hesitation. When Camilla's breathing steadied, Benjamin set about preparing broth from his stores. The familiar motions of cooking centered him, chopping dried vegetables, adding precious pinches of salt, stirring the pot as it bubbled over the fire. The storm's voice grew louder outside, rattling the oiled paper windows and moaning down the chimney. Hours passed before Camilla stirred, her eyes fluttering open to reveal confusion and fever-bright fear. "Where?" She tried to sit up but fell back weakly. "Easy now," Benjamin said, keeping his voice gentle despite its disuse. "You're safe. Storm caught you out there. Brought you to my cabin just in time." He lifted a cup of broth. "Think you can manage some of this?" Camilla nodded slightly, allowing him to help her sit up against the pillows. Her hands shook too much to hold the cup steady, so Benjamin supported it while she sipped. The warm broth brought some color to her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I was thinking riding out like that." Her voice trailed off as exhaustion pulled at her. "Rest now," Benjamin said. "Storm's got us trapped for a spell anyway. Plenty of time for talking later." Over the next 2 days, Camilla drifted between sleep and waking as fever worked through her system. Benjamin kept the fire well fed, venturing out between squalls to split more wood. The familiar rhythm of axe striking wood helped quiet his mind when the strange intimacy of nursing a stranger threatened to overwhelm him. Inside, he kept busy with small tasks, cooking, mending, checking his trap supplies, but his eyes were drawn often to his unexpected guest. In her lucid moments, Camilla watched him with shy curiosity, accepting his quiet care with gentle gratitude. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever finally broke. Camilla woke clear-headed to find Benjamin at his workbench, repairing a snowshoe by lamplight. She studied him openly now, a tall man, broad-shouldered and weather-worn, with a neatly trimmed beard showing threads of gray despite his relatively young age. His movements were careful, deliberate, like someone used to, watching his strength. "You're a trapper?" she asked, her voice stronger now. Benjamin nodded without looking up from his work. "Mostly furs. Trade them down at Fort Collins when weather permits. Do some hunting too, help supply the army post sometimes." "All alone up here?" His hands stilled for a moment. 3 years now, since my Sarah passed." "I'm sorry," Camilla said softly. It must be very lonely. Got used to it. Benjamin set aside the snowshoe and stood, stretching his back. How about some breakfast? You're looking steadier today. Over a simple meal of cornmeal mush and dried apples, they talked more. Benjamin learned Camilla came from Larkspur, though she didn't volunteer why she'd fled into the storm. He didn't press. Everyone had their reasons for running, he reckoned. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, a delicate peace settled between them. Camilla insisted on helping with small tasks as her strength returned, stirring the cooking pot, folding blankets, even attempting to darn a sock, though her stitches were crooked. That third evening, with wind still howling outside, Benjamin brought out his old Bible. The leather binding was worn smooth from years of handling, its pages dog-eared and well-loved. Camilla sat wrapped in quilts by the fire, watching as he settled into his chair. Would you read some?" she asked hesitantly. "It's been so long since I heard the good book read proper." Benjamin opened to a familiar passage, his deep voice filling the cabin with ancient words of comfort. Camilla closed her eyes, letting the familiar verses wash over her. When he finished the chapter, silence held for a long moment, broken only by the pop and crackle of burning pine. "I suppose I should tell you," Camilla said finally, staring into the flames. "Why I was out there that night." She twisted her hands in the quilt. "I'm no one's idea of a proper wife. Can't have children, they say. Too plain, too big, too—" She gestured helplessly at herself. "The ladies at church made sure I knew it. I just couldn't bear their looks anymore. Their whispers." Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Sometimes the Lord puts two lonely folks in the same storm for a reason." Camilla looked up, meeting his steady gaze. Something warm and fragile bloomed in her chest. Not quite hope, but perhaps its beginning. Outside, the storm continued its wild song, but inside the cabin, two wounded souls found unexpected shelter in each other's company. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned lower, each lost in their own thoughts, but no longer quite so alone. Benjamin added another log to the flames, and the sparks rose like stars against the darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, this moment of peace was enough. The morning brought a welcome respite from the howling winds. Weak sunlight filtered through the oiled paper windows, casting pale squares on the cabin's plank floor. Camilla woke early, her strength finally returned after days of rest. The quiet sounds of Benjamin moving about outside drew her from beneath the warm quilts. She found him in the lean-to, checking his trap lines and gear. "Please," she said, startling him slightly. "Let me help around here. I can't just sit idle while you do everything." Benjamin turned, studying her with those careful eyes of his. "You don't owe me anything." "It's not about owing." Camilla twisted her apron between her fingers. "I need to be useful. Please." After a long moment, he nodded. "Reckon there's always work needs doing." That was all the permission Camilla needed. She set to work with quiet determination, first tackling the stack of dishes that had accumulated. The familiar motions of scrubbing and drying settled her mind. Next, she swept the packed earth floor with the rough broom she found behind the door, raising clouds of dust that had gathered in corners over the winter. By midday, the cabin felt different, lived in again, rather than merely survived in. Camilla had found flour and yeast among Benjamin's stores, and the smell of baking bread filled the small space. She hummed softly as she worked, old hymns her grandmother had taught her. Benjamin paused in the doorway, watching her knead dough with strong, sure movements. Something tight in his chest loosened at the sight. He'd forgotten how a woman's presence could transform a place, not just in the obvious ways of cleanliness and order, but in the ineffable sense of home that seemed to follow in their wake. "That smells mighty fine," he said, setting down his armload of firewood. Camilla smiled, a quick flash of joy that transformed her plain features. "Should be ready by supper time. I found some dried apples, too. Thought I might make a pie if you'd like." "Been a long while since I had pie." Benjamin's voice roughened slightly. "Sarah used to make them special for Sundays." "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "No," he cut her off gently. "It's good to remember her sometimes. The happy things." They worked in companionable silence through the afternoon, each to their own tasks. Benjamin mended harness leather while Camilla tackled his pile of worn shirts, her neat stitches replacing his clumsy attempts at repair. The quiet was broken only by the occasional burst of her laughter when she discovered particularly creative patches he'd attempted. As the sun began to set, they sat down to fresh bread, beans, and the promised apple pie. The simple meal felt like a feast after days of broth and hardtack. Benjamin found himself watching Camilla as she ate, noting how she took small, careful bites despite her obvious hunger. "Tell me about your folks," he said suddenly. "Must be worried about you after the storm." Camilla's fork stilled. "Pa passed 2 winters ago. Ma remarried and moved to Denver with her new husband." She pushed a piece of pie around her plate. "Truth is, they'll probably be relieved I'm gone. One less burden to worry over." "Burden?" Benjamin frowned. "You're as capable as any woman I've seen." A bitter smile touched her lips. "That's kind of you to say. But you don't know what they call me in Larkspur." "Fat Camilla the Baron." That's what the church ladies whisper behind their fans. Her voice caught. 25 years old and no prospects, no children, no future but to be a burden on my family's charity. Benjamin's hands tightened on his fork, anger rising at the casual cruelty of it. Before he could speak, Camilla stood abruptly. "I'll wash up," she said, gathering the plates with trembling hands. Later that night, unable to sleep, Benjamin rose to bank the fire. He paused at the sound of Camilla's voice, barely a whisper in the darkness. "I know I can't have children, Lord," she prayed. "Help me make peace with that. Help me find some purpose that doesn't depend on being someone's wife or mother. I'm trying so hard to accept your will, but some days it feels like too heavy a cross to bear." Benjamin turned away silently, his heart heavy with understanding. He'd seen how she flinched at her own reflection, how she made herself small despite her natural grace. It wasn't just loneliness that drove her into that storm. It was shame, ground into her soul by years of thoughtless words and judgmental stares. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Sunlight glinted off the snow like scattered diamonds, and the air held that particular stillness that comes after a great storm. Benjamin stood in the doorway, considering the lay of the land and the state of his supplies. "Need to make a run to town," he announced over breakfast. "We're low on some essentials, and I should send word about you being safe." He hesitated, then added, "Thought you might want to come along." Camilla looked up, surprise clear on her face. "To town? But what will people say?" "Reckon that depends on what you want them to say." Benjamin met her eyes steadily. "You don't have to go back to Larkspur if you don't want to, but hiding away won't heal what's hurting you neither." Camilla sat very still, considering his words. Finally, she nodded slowly. "You're right. I can't hide forever." She squared her shoulders, a determined light entering her eyes. "Besides, you'll need help loading supplies." Benjamin felt a surge of admiration for her courage. Without comment, He went to saddle his horse while Camilla gathered her shawl and borrowed one of his warmer coats. The morning air was crisp and clean as they prepared for the journey, their breath forming white clouds in the sunshine. As Benjamin helped Camilla mount behind him, he noticed she held herself straight and proud, despite her obvious nervousness. Her arms circled his waist tentatively as the horse picked its way through the melting snow. "Thank you," she said softly, her words nearly lost in the creak of leather and the horse's steady breathing. "Not just for saving my life, but for—" She paused, searching for words. "For seeing me. The real me, not just what others say I am." Benjamin laid one hand briefly over hers, where it rested against his coat. "Reckon we've both been seeing clearer these past few days." They rode on in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, the fresh snow gradually giving way to muddy tracks as they descended toward civilization. Benjamin found himself acutely aware of Camilla's quiet presence behind him, her trust in letting him guide their path, and the way her occasional soft humming blended with the natural sounds of the winter morning. The trail to town stretched ahead, but for the first time in years, Benjamin didn't feel the usual dread of facing other people. Something had shifted in these days of storm-bound companionship, a thawing that went deeper than the melting snow. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he knew with certainty that neither of them would walk it alone. The morning sun had climbed high by the time Benjamin's wagon rattled down the muddy track toward Larkspur. Camilla sat beside him on the wooden seat, her borrowed coat pulled tight against the chill. The familiar church spire rose above the pines, making her stomach clench with memories of that bitter night she'd fled. "You all right?" Benjamin asked, noting her tension. "Yes," she said, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the seat. "Just been a while since I faced town folks." Benjamin clicked his tongue at the horses, guiding them around a deep rut. "Remember what I said. You've got nothing to be ashamed of." The main street came into view, lined with false-fronted buildings and muddy boardwalks. Heads turned as Benjamin's wagon approached. His impressive height and wild beard always drew stares, but today the whispers were about his companion. Camilla felt the weight of curious eyes as they passed the milliner's shop, where three ladies paused their conversation to gawk. "That's Fat Camilla," she heard one whisper. "With the mountain man." Benjamin's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward. They pulled up in front of Dawson's Mercantile, the horse's hooves squelching in the spring mud. Before helping Camilla down, Benjamin straightened to his full height, his presence almost daring anyone to make a comment. The store bell jangled as they entered. Mr. Dawson, thin and stoop-shouldered, looked up from his ledger. His eyes widened at the sight of Camilla. "Miss Whitcomb," he said carefully. "Folks was wondering what became of you after the social." "I'm fine, Mr. Dawson," Camilla replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Just need some supplies today." She began gathering items: flour, coffee, sugar, and thread. Benjamin moved through the store with his own list, adding ammunition and tools to their pile. When everything was assembled on the counter, Dawson began tallying. "That'll be $8.45, he announced. "Though," he glanced at Camilla, "I can't extend credit to you anymore, Miss Whitcomb. Your pa's account's being closed and all." Camilla's face flushed. She started to step back, but Benjamin moved forward, laying $3 silver on the counter. "She's with me," he said quietly. The words were simple, but his tone carried weight. "Add whatever else she needs." Dawson's manner changed immediately. "Yes, sir, Mr. Creed. Right away." Camilla added a few more necessities, including a length of calico she'd been eyeing. While Dawson wrapped their purchases, she noticed Benjamin examining a shelf of seed packets. "Getting late for planting," Dawson commented. "Maybe," Benjamin replied, selecting several packets. "But the ground thaws late up in the high country. Might work." They loaded the wagon efficiently, working together as if they'd done it many times before. The sun had reached its peak, warming the spring air enough to make their coats unnecessary. "Hungry?" Benjamin asked, pulling out a cloth-wrapped package. Camilla nodded, and they settled on the wagon's tailgate, away from the bustle of the street. She'd packed biscuits that morning, and Benjamin produced cheese and dried apple slices to go with them. "These biscuits," he said after his first bite, "might be the best I've ever had." Camilla ducked her head, pleased. "My grandmother's recipe. She always said the secret was using cold butter and a light hand." For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, watching the town's activities. Children chased hoops down the street while their mothers called after them. A group of men argued politics outside the barber shop. It felt almost normal, Camilla thought, like she belonged here after all. The peace was broken by the approach of 3 men in citified clothes. The leader, wearing a bowler hat and carrying a leather portfolio, fixed Benjamin with an official stare. "Mr. Benjamin Creed?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Benjamin set down his biscuit slowly. "Who's asking?" "Gilbert Thornton, Land Office agent." The man produced a badge. "These gentlemen represent the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. We need to discuss your property." Benjamin's expression didn't change, but Camilla felt him tense beside her. "What about my property?" Thornton opened his portfolio, removing a map. "Your claim lies directly in the path of the planned railway extension. According to our surveys, you're occupying 160 acres of prime right-of-way." "That land's mine," Benjamin said quietly, "properly filed and worked these past 5 years." One of the railroad men, a florid-faced fellow in an expensive suit, stepped forward. "The railroad is prepared to offer fair compensation." "Not for sale." Benjamin's voice was flat. Thornton cleared his throat. "Mr. Creed, the matter isn't that simple. Your original filing was as a family homestead, requiring continuous residence and improvements. Our records show your wife passed 3 years ago, and you've been living alone since." Camilla saw Benjamin's hands clench. "What of it?" "The law is clear," Thornton continued. "A family homestead must be maintained as such. Single men can file claims, but they must prove up within 12 months. You've had 3 years of grace, Mr. Creed, but with the railroad's pressing interest, we must resolve this." "Meaning what exactly?" Benjamin's tone had grown dangerous. "You have 60 days to prove your claim meets family homestead requirements," Thornton said, consulting his papers. "That means a wife, evidence of permanent residence, and demonstrated improvements to the land. Without such proof, the claim reverts to the government, and the railroad's offer becomes moot." The railroad man tried again. "Our offer is more than generous. Get off my wagon." Benjamin stood, his height making the 3 men step back. "I've got my proof, and I'll have it ready when needed." Thornton nodded stiffly. 60 days, Mr. Creed. Good day to you both." He touched his hat to Camilla before leading his companions away. Benjamin remained standing, watching them go. Camilla saw the muscle working in his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. Without thinking, she touched his arm gently. "Benjamin? What will you do?" He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Don't rightly know yet." He helped her pack away the remains of their lunch. "Best get these supplies loaded. Long ride home ahead." They worked in silence, each lost in thought. As Benjamin helped Camilla up to the wagon seat, she noticed more townspeople watching them, no doubt wondering about the scene they'd witnessed. The whispers would be flying before sunset. Benjamin climbed up beside her and took the reins. The horses moved forward eagerly, sensing home ahead. As they left town behind, Camilla watched Benjamin's profile, seeing the worry he tried to hide. "You could sell," she said softly. "Take their money, start fresh somewhere else." He shook his head. "That land's not just property. It's where Sarah lies, where we planned our future." He glanced at her. "Some things are worth fighting for." Camilla nodded, understanding more than she could say. They rode on as the afternoon sun began its slow descent, the wagon's wheels leaving twin tracks in the muddy road toward home. The cabin's familiar walls seemed to close in around Benjamin as he sat in his wooden chair, staring into the dancing flames. The fire's warmth couldn't chase away the chill that had settled in his bones since their encounter with the land agent. Camilla moved quietly around the cabin, putting away their purchases from town, her skirts brushing against the rough-hewn floorboards. Night pressed against the window panes, and Benjamin's Bible lay unopened in his lap. His calloused fingers traced the worn leather binding, finding no comfort in its familiar texture. The crack and pop of burning pine filled the silence between them. "Would you like some tea?" Camilla's soft voice broke through, his brooding. He looked up, noticing how the firelight caught the loose strands of hair around her face. "Much obliged," he managed, his voice rough from hours of disuse. She hung the iron kettle over the fire, and the homey sound of water beginning to bubble joined the evening's quiet symphony. Benjamin watched her efficient movements, seeing how naturally she fit into the cabin's routines after just these few weeks. "My Sarah," he said suddenly, surprising himself. "She loved this place, said it was closer to heaven up here in the mountains." Camilla paused in measuring tea leaves. "Tell me about her." Benjamin shifted in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. "She was strong, had to be to live up here, but gentle too. Always planning, wanted a proper garden, talked about raising sheep." He swallowed hard. When the fever took her, seemed like all those dreams went with her. "And now the railroad wants to take what's left," Camilla said softly, understanding in her voice. "This ain't just land," Benjamin's voice grew fierce. "It's everything we built, everything she dreamed of. Her grave's up on that rise, where the wildflowers bloom in summer." Camilla brought him the steaming cup, her own hands wrapped around another. "You won't give it up without a fight," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am, I won't." They sat together, sipping tea and watching the fire burn low. Eventually, Camilla retired to the small room Benjamin had given her, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the dying embers. Morning came too soon, gray light seeping through the windows. Benjamin was already up, having slept poorly, when hoofbeats approached the cabin. Through the window, he recognized the land agent's bowler hat bobbing along the trail. "Mr. Thornton's coming," he called to Camilla, who was just emerging from her room. She quickly smoothed her hair and straightened her apron as Benjamin opened the door. Gilbert Thornton dismounted, looking distinctly uncomfortable about the mud on his polished boots. "Mr. Creed," he said, nodding. "Miss Whitcomb, I've come to mark the preliminary boundaries for the survey crew." Benjamin's heart pounded against his ribs. Everything he and Sarah had worked for, everything they'd dreamed of, was about to be measured and divided like so much butcher's meat. The words came out before he could think them through. "This is my betrothed, Camilla Whitcomb." The silence that followed felt thick enough to cut. Camilla's sharp intake of breath was the only sound. Thornton's eyebrows rose as he pulled out his notebook. "You're betrothed?" he asked, pencil poised. Benjamin straightened to his full height, praying his voice wouldn't betray him. "Yes, sir. We're to be married before summer's end." Thornton scribbled in his notebook, looking between them. Well, that certainly changes matters. A pending marriage would satisfy the family requirement, provided the ceremony takes place within a reasonable time frame. He cleared his throat. I'll make note of this in the official record. Much obliged, Benjamin said stiffly. The agent made a few more notes, then tipped his hat to Camilla. Congratulations to you both. I'll inform the railroad company of this development. He mounted his horse, clearly eager to leave the muddy mountain trail behind. They watched him ride away, standing frozen on the cabin's porch. When his bowler hat disappeared around the bend, Camilla turned to Benjamin, her face flushed. Why did you say that? Her voice trembled slightly. Benjamin's shoulders slumped. The magnitude of what he'd done hit him like a physical blow. I'm sorry, Camilla. I had no right to speak for you that way. He ran a hand through his beard. The truth is, without a family claim, I'll lose everything. Not just the land, but Sarah's resting place, our dreams, all of it. He forced himself to meet her eyes, expecting anger or disgust. Instead, he found something that looked like understanding. When my grandmother died, she said slowly, they sold her herb garden to pay debts, planted tobacco where her healing plants used to grow. She wrapped her arms around herself. I know what it means to lose something precious. Benjamin nodded, throat tight. I'll find another way. You don't need to be part of this mess. Camilla studied his hands, rough and scarred from years of honest work. The morning sun touched her face as she considered, making her look almost luminous. Finally, she whispered, I'll help you keep what's yours. What? Benjamin wasn't sure he'd heard right. I said I'll help you. Her voice grew stronger. We can court properly, make it look real. After the railroad gives up, we can end it quietly. You'd do that? After how folks treated you in town? A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Maybe it's time I stopped running from their words. Besides, she added softly, you've been kind to me. Let me be kind in return. Benjamin felt humbled by her offer. It won't be easy. People will talk. People already talk. She squared her shoulders. At least this time, I choose the reason. He held out his hand, work roughened and honest. Then we have an agreement? Camilla's smaller hand met his, warm and sure. We do. They stood there, hands clasped in the morning light, as a spring wind rustled through the pines. From somewhere in the distance came the haunting call of wolves, wild and lonely. But inside the cabin, something new and fragile was taking root. A trust born of shared understanding and common purpose. Benjamin released her hand gently. I'll need to fix that loose shutter today, he said, moving toward familiar tasks to steady himself. And I'll start breakfast, Camilla replied, equally grateful for the return to routine. Flapjacks, if you've a mind for them? That would be fine, he said, already reaching for his tools. They moved through the morning's tasks, each aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. Their comfortable silence now held the weight of shared secrets and mutual dependency. The mountain air seemed clearer somehow, as if the truth they'd spoken had cleaned away some invisible haze. Benjamin paused in his work to watch Camilla through the window as she moved about the cabin's interior. She had brought life back to spaces that had been hollow since Sarah's passing. Not the same life, something different, but no less valuable. He sent up a silent prayer, asking forgiveness for his deception, while thanking God for sending him someone who understood the worth of things that couldn't be measured in railroad dollars. Inside, Camilla worked steadily, her hands sure as she mixed batter and stoked the stove. Her mind turned over their new arrangement, testing it like uncertain ice on a winter pond. She had agreed to this pretense, this careful dance of appearances. But something in Benjamin's quiet strength made her wonder if perhaps they were building more than just a shield against the railroad's ambitions. The morning deepened around them, sun climbing higher above the mountains. Their shared secret settled into place like a foundation stone, something to build upon, something to trust in, something to protect them both from the wolves that howled in the distance. The week passed in a blur of preparations and quiet industry. Benjamin spent his days repairing the cabin's roof, patching holes winter had worn, while Camilla scrubbed and organized inside. They worked in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the approaching ceremony. On the 7th morning, Benjamin rose before dawn. The spring thaw had begun in earnest, turning the mountain paths treacherous with mud and half-melted snow. He pulled on his heavy boots and wool coat, checking the leather satchel that held clean clothes and his mother's silver Bible. Camilla met him at the door, a cloth-wrapped package in her hands. "For your journey," she said softly. "Biscuits and jerky." "Much obliged." He tucked the food into his saddlebag. "I should be back by tomorrow evening, God willing." She nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. "I'll keep things right here." Benjamin mounted his horse, adjusting the stirrups. "There's plenty of firewood stacked by the door, and my rifle's loaded just in case." "I'll be fine," she assured him, a small smile touching her lips. "Been taking care of myself a fair while now." He tipped his hat, something catching in his throat at the sight of her standing in his doorway, looking so natural there. Without another word, he turned his horse toward town and the circuit preacher. The ride was slow going. Melting snow had turned the narrow mountain trails into ribbons of mud. Benjamin's horse picked its way carefully, steam rising from its flanks in the cool air. He used the time to pray, asking for guidance, for wisdom, for peace about this arrangement that felt both necessary and somehow holy, despite its practical beginnings. Back at the cabin, Camilla kept her hands busy. She swept the plank floor until it shone, hung fresh curtains she'd sewn from feed sacks, and set a pot of venison stew to simmer. The familiar tasks couldn't quite still the flutter in her stomach. Tomorrow she would be a wife, not in the way she'd once dreamed, perhaps, but a wife nonetheless. As evening approached, she climbed to the cabin's loft where she'd been sleeping. From her trunk, she pulled out her best dress, faded blue calico, but clean and carefully mended. Beside it lay her mother's lace collar, yellowed with age but still beautiful. She touched it gently, remembering how her mother had worn it on special occasions, how it had made her feel elegant despite their poverty. The night passed slowly. Camilla tended the fire and stirred her stew, listening to the wind in the pines and the occasional cry of a distant coyote. She wondered what Benjamin was doing, if he'd found the preacher, if he was having second thoughts about this whole arrangement. Morning brought weak sunshine and more melting snow. Camilla dressed carefully in her blue dress, pinned up her hair, and fastened her mother's collar at her throat. She was just pulling the stew pot closer to the fire when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Benjamin appeared first, looking trail-worn but determined. Behind him rode a slight man with graying hair and kind eyes, Reverend Matthews, the circuit preacher. They dismounted, stamping mud from their boots before entering the cabin. "Miss Whitcomb," the preacher said warmly, taking her hand. "Mr. Creed has explained your situation. A quiet ceremony," he said. "Yes, Reverend," she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "We're simple folk." "The Lord sees beauty in simplicity," he assured her. "Shall we begin?" Benjamin had changed into clean clothes, dark trousers and a white shirt she'd mended last week. He stood straight and tall beside her as Reverend Matthews opened his Bible. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, catching dust motes in its golden light. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and simmering stew. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, his voice filling the small space, "we are gathered here in the sight of God." Camilla felt Benjamin's sleeve brush against her arm as they stood together. The familiar words washed over her. Love, honor, cherish. Words she'd heard at other weddings, never thinking she'd hear them spoken for her. When it came time for the ring, Benjamin's hands trembled slightly as he brought out something that caught the lamplight. Not a store-bought ring, they hadn't discussed that, but a delicate band he'd fashioned himself from braided silver wire. The metal was cool against her finger as he slipped it on, his rough fingers gentle against her skin. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Matthews declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." There was no kiss. They hadn't discussed that either. Just a moment of shared glance, a quiet acknowledgement of what had passed between them. The wedding supper was simple but filling: venison stew, fresh bread, and the last of Camilla's preserved peaches. They ate by lamplight, the preacher filling the silence with tales of his circuit rides through the territory. When the meal was done, they all bowed their heads while Reverend Matthews offered a prayer of blessing. "The Lord watch between you when you are absent one from another," he concluded. Then he gathered his things, mounted his horse, and rode away into the gathering dusk, leaving the newly married couple alone. Benjamin busied himself banking the fire while Camilla cleared away the supper things. Their movements were careful, almost shy, as if they were strangers again instead of people who had shared a home for weeks. "I'll take the barn tonight," Benjamin said quietly. "Got to check on a sick calf anyway." Camilla nodded, relief and something like disappointment mingling in her chest. "Good night then," she managed. "And thank you for the ring." He ducked his head. "Ain't much, but I reckoned you should have something." Then he was gone, boots thumping across the porch, leaving Camilla alone in what was now officially her home. She climbed the ladder to the loft, changed into her nightdress, and lay down on her narrow bed. The fire popped below, a comforting sound she'd grown used to over the past weeks. Through the small window she could see stars pricking through the darkening sky. Her left hand found the ring, fingers tracing its braided pattern. Was this truly just for duty? The question that had nagged at her all day grew stronger in the darkness. She thought of Benjamin's trembling hands as he placed the ring, the careful way he'd prepared the cabin for her arrival, his quiet strength that asked nothing but offered everything. Sleep was long in coming. Camilla lay awake, listening to the fire's soft music, feeling the weight of her new ring, and wondering what tomorrow would bring. She was a wife now, Benjamin Creed's wife. The thought brought both terror and a strange sort of peace. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the last chill of winter. But inside the cabin, something warm and uncertain was taking root, like the first fragile shoots of spring pushing through melting snow. Days lengthened as winter's grip loosened on the mountain. Snow retreated in patches, revealing tender green shoots beneath. The change came gradual-like, much as the shift in Benjamin and Camilla's daily dance around each other in the cabin they now shared as husband and wife. Camilla rose early each morning, stoking the banked fire before Benjamin stirred from his pallet in the barn. She'd grown used to his routines, the sound of boots on the porch, the quiet morning he'd offer as he came in to warm his hands by the stove. They'd share breakfast, usually cornmeal mush with molasses, before he headed out to check his trap lines. This morning, she watched from the doorway as he adjusted his pack, the dawn painting the sky in soft pinks and purples. "Mind yourself out there," she said, the words becoming familiar on her tongue. He touched the brim of his hat. "Always do. Reckon I'll be back by sundown." Once he'd gone, Camilla turned to her own tasks. The cabin, though sturdy, had suffered from years of bachelor living. Each day brought new projects, scrubbing floorboards, hanging fresh curtains, organizing Benjamin's scattered tools and supplies into proper order. Near the porch, she'd started a small herb garden. The soil was rocky, but she'd seen wild yarrow and feverfew growing nearby, suggesting good ground for medicinals. Benjamin had watched her dig the beds without comment, but the next day she'd found a stack of trimmed logs perfect for bordering the garden. She knelt now in the soft earth, transplanting the first seedlings she'd started in cups on the windowsill. Thyme, sage, and mint would grow here, along with the healing herbs she'd learned about from her grandmother. The work was peaceful, connecting her to memories of better days before shame had driven her from home. The sun climbed higher as she worked. When Benjamin returned mid-morning with his catch, she had bread rising on the counter and a pot of beans simmering over the fire. He paused in the doorway, taking in the transformed cabin, swept clean, curtains stirring in the breeze, dried herbs hanging from the rafters. "Place looks different," he said quietly. "Good different, I hope?" His eyes met hers briefly. "Reckon so." They fell into a rhythm as the days passed. Benjamin showed her how to haul water from the creek, though he insisted on doing the heaviest work himself. She learned to recognize the sound of his axe as he split wood, the steady thunk-crack echoing through the trees. One afternoon, while pulling a fresh loaf from the oven, Camilla's hand slipped. The hot pan seared her palm, drawing a sharp cry of pain. Benjamin was through the door before the sound faded, concern etched on his weathered face. "Let me see," he said, reaching for her hand. "It's nothing." She started, but he was already leading her to the water bucket. "Cold water first," he instructed, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her submerge the burn. After a moment, he retrieved a jar of salve from his supplies. "Made this from bear grease and herbs. Works good on burns." The ointment was cool against her skin as he spread it carefully across her palm. Camilla watched his bent head, the tenderness in his touch bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. This courtesy, this gentle care, it confused her more than any man's crude desires ever had. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, releasing her hand slowly. "Best keep it clean. I can manage supper tonight." That evening, they sat together while he read from his Bible, as had become their custom. Camilla's burned hand throbbed gently, but the pain was eased by more than just the salve. Something in her walls had cracked, letting in a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Spring advanced steadily. The days grew longer, and the mountain trails dried enough for proper riding. One clear afternoon, Benjamin suggested they check the fence lines together. "Needs doing," he said, saddling his horse. "And you ought to know the property boundaries, being—" He trailed off, but Camilla heard the unspoken word, wife. She rode the gentle mare Benjamin had traded for, replacing her father's old mule. The air was crisp with pine scent, and new grass carpeted the meadows they passed. Benjamin pointed out landmarks, lightning-struck trees, distinctive rocks, the creek's bends that marked their land. Near the western fence line, they came upon a small herd of elk grazing in a sunny meadow. Benjamin reined in, signaling Camilla to stop. They watched in silence as the animals moved through the grass, their coats catching the afternoon light. Even the wild knows when to trust the season, Benjamin remarked softly. Camilla smiled, understanding flowing between them like the gentle spring breeze. She felt it then, clear as sunrise. Safety. Not just the physical security of walls and roof, but the deeper peace of being truly seen, accepted, protected. That evening, as they rode home in the lengthening shadows, Camilla found herself studying her husband's profile. The months of ridicule and shame that had driven her into that winter storm seemed distant now, like a bad dream fading in morning light. Benjamin helped her down from her horse, his hands steady at her waist. "Thank you," she said, meaning more than just the assistance. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Reckon we both needed a fresh season." Inside, they moved through their evening routine. Beans and biscuits for supper, prayers before bed, banking the fire for morning. But something had shifted, subtle as spring thaw, strong as the mountain beneath them. Trust had taken root, growing as surely as Camilla's herbs by the porch. When Benjamin headed for the barn that night, his customary "sleep well" carried a warmth that had nothing to do with courtesy. Camilla climbed to her loft, touching the silver ring he'd made her. She felt safe, not just in body, but in heart. Like the elk in the meadow, she had found her season to trust. In the quiet darkness, she whispered a prayer of gratitude. Outside, spring winds whispered through the pines, carrying winter's last chill away. The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows as Camilla worked her way through spring cleaning. Benjamin had ridden out at dawn to check his trap lines, leaving her alone with the satisfying work of setting their home in order. Her fingers traced the rough-hewn shelves, carefully removing items to dust beneath them. In the corner stood an old trunk she hadn't yet explored, its leather straps cracked with age. Camilla hesitated, not wanting to pry into Benjamin's private things. But they were, married now, she reasoned, and the trunk needed cleaning like everything else. The hinges creaked as she lifted the lid. Inside lay neatly folded clothes that carried the musty smell of long storage. She lifted each item carefully. A woman's shawl, delicate despite its wear, a pair of small boots, a faded quilt. Sarah's things, she realized. Benjamin's first wife. Near the bottom, tucked between the folds of a dress, she found a letter. The envelope was yellowed but unopened, addressed in a careful hand to Mrs. Sarah Creed. The sight of it made Camilla's heart skip. This was more than just stored memories. This was something Benjamin had never seen. She held the letter, uncertain. The proper thing would be to show it to Benjamin, but the thought made her stomach tighten. Whatever words that envelope held had been meant for Sarah's eyes alone. Yet keeping it hidden felt wrong, like a betrayal of the trust growing between them. The sound of hoofbeats outside made her decision for her. She quickly replaced the clothes but kept the letter, closing the trunk as Benjamin's boots sounded on the porch. "Brought home a nice rabbit," he called as he entered, then paused at the sight of her face. "Something wrong?" Camilla held out the envelope. "I found this while cleaning. It's addressed to Sarah." Benjamin's expression shifted as he took the letter, his fingers trembling slightly. "Where was it?" "In the trunk, with her things. I'm sorry if I shouldn't have—" "No," he cut in softly. "You did right to show me." He studied the envelope for a long moment. "Reckon I should read it. Would you like me to make some coffee first?" He shook his head. "Think I need to do this alone." Without another word, he walked out, heading toward the barn where he spent his nights. Camilla forced herself to continue cleaning, though her hands shook as she worked. The sun had moved significantly before she heard Benjamin's heavy steps returning. When he entered, She knew immediately something was terribly wrong. His face had gone gray, and his eyes held a haunted look she'd never seen before. "Benjamin?" she ventured softly. He sank into a chair by the cold hearth, the letter crumpled in his fist. "All this time," he said, his voice rough. "All these years I've been blaming myself, thinking I drove her to it." Camilla moved closer, her heart aching at the pain in his words. "What do you mean?" "Sarah." He smoothed the crushed paper with trembling fingers. She was carrying a child when she died. Not mine. Letters from the father, some drummer who passed through town while I was away scouting. His breath hitched. She couldn't live with the shame. Took poison. "Oh, Benjamin." Camilla's hand found his shoulder, feeling the tension there. "I found her." The words seemed torn from him. "Came home early from a trading run. She was already gone. No note, nothing to explain why." His shoulders began to shake. "I've carried the guilt all these years, thinking I hadn't loved her enough, hadn't been home enough. Blamed myself for her death." Tears rolled down his weathered cheeks. Camilla stood frozen, her hand still on his shoulder, as years of pent-up grief poured out of him. "I tried to make it right," he continued brokenly. "Living clean, reading scripture, working honest. Thought maybe if I did everything proper, God might forgive me for failing her." He looked up at Camilla, his eyes raw with pain. "But it wasn't my fault. She chose her path." Camilla pulled him close, letting him weep against her apron while her own tears fell silently. All his gruff manner, his strict routines, his careful distance, they made sense now. He'd been doing penance for a sin he hadn't committed. When his tears finally slowed, she made coffee and sat with him until dusk painted the cabin walls in purple shadows. He spoke little, lost in memories, but his hand found hers across the table and held on like a drowning man clutching a rope. That night, after Benjamin retreated to the barn, Camilla lay awake in her loft, her heart heavy with new understanding. She thought of Sarah, desperate and alone with her secret, of Benjamin, carrying unearned guilt for years, and of herself, barren and marked by shame, unable to give him the redemption he'd been seeking. "Lord," she whispered into the darkness, "how can I help heal him when I'm broken too?" The next morning, she rose before dawn and began to fast, drinking only water as she went about her tasks. Benjamin noticed at breakfast but said nothing when she claimed a headache. By evening, hunger gnawed at her, but she welcomed it. This was her offering, her way of seeking clarity. Days passed in quiet routine. Benjamin worked his trap lines while Camilla tended house, their conversations gentle but guarded. She continued her fast, praying in stolen moments for guidance. The cabin glowed with domestic peace. Fresh swept floors, herbs drying from rafters, Benjamin's boots by the door. But beneath it lay currents of unspoken pain. She caught him watching her sometimes with worried eyes, noting how she picked at her food or grew pale by evening. But he didn't press her, perhaps recognizing in her withdrawal something of his own long solitude. One evening, as she stirred the fire, he spoke suddenly. "You don't have to punish yourself." Camilla's hand stilled on the poker. "I'm not. I'm seeking answers." "About what?" She turned to face him, finding courage in the firelight's warmth. "About how to be enough, how to help heal your heart when I can't." She gestured helplessly at herself. "When I can't give you what Sarah couldn't." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "A child?" She nodded, tears spilling. "You've carried such guilt, thinking you failed her, but I'm the one who's truly barren. What kind of wife am I who can't even— Stop." His voice was gentle but firm. "You're fasting yourself sick over this?" I need to know God's will, she whispered. If he brought us together, there must be a purpose beyond just saving your land. Benjamin crossed to her, his steps heavy with decision. Maybe the purpose was saving me from myself. He took her hands in his large ones. I've been a fool, hiding from life in my grief. But you brought warmth back to this cabin, made it a home again. His fingers tightened. Don't starve yourself seeking answers we don't need. Fresh tears fell as Camilla looked up at him. In his face, she saw the same lost hope she carried, but also something new, a tentative reaching toward healing. They were both broken, both seeking redemption. Maybe that was answer enough for now. The fire crackled softly in the hearth as they stood together, neither speaking, both aware that something had shifted between them. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the gathering dusk, its song echoing across the mountainside like a prayer. Dark clouds gathered over the mountain ridges, casting deep shadows across Benjamin's homestead. The air grew thick and heavy, promising a summer storm. Camilla stood in her herb garden, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cooling breeze. She had been fasting for 5 days now, taking only sips of water, and her body felt lighter than air. The herbs swayed before her eyes, yarrow, sage, and mint blurring together in a green haze. She reached for a stem of lavender, but the world tilted sideways. Her knees buckled. Camilla! Benjamin's voice cut through her dizziness. He must have been watching from where he'd been mending fence nearby. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. I'm fine, she protested weakly, but her head lolled against his chest. Like hell you are. His voice was gruff with worry as he lifted her. The familiar scent of leather and pine surrounded her as he carried her toward the cabin. This foolishness has gone on long enough. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Benjamin shouldered open the door. He set her gently in the rocking chair by the hearth, then strode to the kitchen shelf for a cup of water. Drink, he ordered, pressing it into her trembling hands. Camilla took a small sip. I'm sorry to worry you. Then stop starving yourself. He knelt before her, his face lined with concern. What are you trying to prove? Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the cabin in stark white. Camilla's fingers tightened around the cup. I'm trying to understand his will, she whispered. To know if I'm worthy of... Her voice caught. Of being your wife. A real wife. Thunder crashed closer now, and rain began drumming on the roof. Benjamin's eyes softened as he watched her. You already are. She shook her head, tears spilling. But I can't give you children. Can't take away your pain about Sarah. I'm just another broken person you've taken in from charity. Camilla. His large hands covered hers on the cup, warm and steady. Look at me. She raised her eyes reluctantly to meet his. In them she saw not pity or disappointment, but something deeper that made her breath catch. You're not my burden, he said softly. You're my answer. His thumb brushed away a tear from her cheek. All these years I've been hiding up here, thinking solitude was my penance. Then you came, bringing life back into these walls, making me remember what it means to care for someone again. The storm raged outside, but in the cabin everything had gone still. Camilla could hear her heart pounding as Benjamin continued, his voice rough with emotion. I married you to keep my land, yes, but these past weeks... He drew a shaky breath. I've been falling in love with your strength, your kindness, the way you hum while you work, the way you pray with such faith, even when you're hurting. Fresh tears spilled down Camilla's cheeks. Benjamin, you don't need to prove anything to me or to God. His hands framed her face gently. You're enough. Just as you are." A sob caught in her throat as years of shame and longing crashed through her defenses. Benjamin gathered her into his arms, and she buried her face in his shoulder, letting the tears come. His hands stroked her back as the storm howled around their shelter. When her tears finally slowed, she became aware of their closeness, his heartbeat against her cheek, the strength in his arms, the way his breath stirred her hair. She lifted her head to look at him. Lightning flashed again, catching the silver in his beard and the tenderness in his eyes. Slowly, giving her time to pull away, he lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. Camilla's hands slid up to his shoulders as she answered, drawing him closer. Thunder rolled overhead as the kiss deepened, years of loneliness melting away in the warmth between them. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, Benjamin rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he whispered, "not for what you can or can't give me, just for who you are." "I love you too," she breathed, the words carrying all her heart's truth. "I think I have since you first took me in from the cold." He kissed her again, and this time there was nothing hesitant about it. The storm's fury matched the passion they'd both held back for so long. When Benjamin lifted her in his arms, she wound her arms around his neck, trusting completely. He carried her to their bedroom, no longer his alone, and laid her on the quilt with infinite care. Rain lashed the windows as they came together, no longer two wounded souls seeking shelter, but husband and wife finding healing in each other's love. The storm raged through the night, but they were safe in their sanctuary of touch and whispered devotion. Thunder shook the mountains and lightning split the sky, while inside the cabin, two hearts became truly one. Dawn broke clear and golden over the peaks. The storm had washed everything clean. Pine needles glittered with droplets, and the air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. Birds called from the branches, greeting the morning with song. Camilla woke to sunlight streaming through the window and Benjamin's arm around her waist. For the first time since coming to the cabin, she felt completely at peace. No more shame, no more unworthiness, just the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. "Good morning," Benjamin murmured, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. She turned in his arms, smiling at the contentment in his face. All the hard edges had softened, the shadows of guilt replaced by quiet joy. "Good morning, husband." His answering smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Outside, a thrush trilled sweetly in the rain-washed pines, singing of hope and fresh starts and love that heals all wounds. The morning after the storm dawned bright and clear, marking the beginning of 3 golden days that seemed blessed by heaven itself. The mountain air carried a fresh sweetness, as if the rain had washed away not just the dust, but all the old hurts and doubts that had lingered in Benjamin and Camilla's hearts. Benjamin found himself humming as he worked, something he hadn't done since Sarah's death. The steady rhythm of his axe splitting wood echoed through the clearing, matching the cheerful tune that rose unbidden from his throat. From the cabin's open window, he could hear Camilla's clear voice lifting in hymns as she worked at the stove, their melodies weaving together like sunlight through leaves. "You're in fine spirits," Camilla called out, appearing in the doorway with a cup of coffee. Her hair caught the morning light, and the sight of her made his heart swell. Benjamin paused his work, wiping his brow as he accepted the cup. "Reckon I've got reason to be." He pulled her close with his free arm, breathing in the scent of fresh bread that clung to her apron. Later that afternoon, Benjamin saddled their horses for a ride. "There's a meadow I want to show you," he said, helping Camilla mount. "It'll be full of wildflowers after the rain." They rode side by side along a narrow trail that wound through stands of aspen. Their horses' hooves made soft sounds against the damp earth, and chickadees called from the branches overhead. When they emerged into the meadow, Camilla gasped in delight. The clearing stretched before them like a painted canvas, awash in purple lupin and golden blanket flower. White columbines nodded in the gentle breeze, and red Indian paintbrush stood like tiny flames among the grass. "It's beautiful," Camilla breathed, sliding from her saddle. She moved through the flowers with careful steps, gathering a bouquet while Benjamin watched from his horse, his heart full at the sight of her joy. "Maybe we could build a cradle," he said suddenly, surprising himself. "For someday?" Camilla's hands stilled on a stem of lupine. She laughed, but there was a catch in her voice. "Benjamin Creed, you're a dreamer." "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said softly. She didn't answer, but her smile held a mixture of hope and gentle disbelief as she added more flowers to her bundle. They stayed until the sun began to sink behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the meadow. On the ride home, Camilla swayed slightly in her saddle. "You all right?" Benjamin asked, noticing her pallor. "Just a bit lightheaded," she assured him, "probably from all this happiness." That evening, they sat at their table sharing a hearty rabbit stew Camilla had prepared. Steam rose from their bowls as Benjamin bowed his head to pray. "Lord, we thank you for this bounty," he said, his rough hand clasping Camilla's smaller one. "For the coming harvest, for this home, and most especially for bringing us together. Amen." "Amen," Camilla echoed softly. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the clink of spoons and the distant call of a whippoorwill. Through the window, they could see the first stars appearing in the deepening blue of the sky. "I never thought I could be this happy again," Benjamin admitted, reaching across the table to touch her cheek. Camilla leaned into his touch. "The Lord gives second chances," she said, "even to those who think they don't deserve them." They went to bed that night, wrapped in contentment, the cabin quiet except for the soft sounds of their breathing and the occasional pop from the banked fire. The next morning dawned clear and promised another beautiful day. Benjamin woke early, as usual, pressing a gentle kiss to Camilla's forehead before heading out to start the morning chores. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. He was stacking firewood when he heard the scatter of chickens and a soft thump from the direction of the coop. Looking up, he saw Camilla crumpled on the ground, the feed bucket spilled beside her. "Camilla!" His heart lurched as he dropped the wood and ran, reaching her just before she would have struck her head on the coop's doorframe. He caught her against his chest, sinking to his knees as he cradled her limp form. Her face was white as chalk, her skin clammy to the touch. Her eyes fluttered but didn't open, and her breath came in shallow gasps. "Camilla, can you hear me?" His voice cracked with fear as he patted her cheek. "Sweetheart, open your eyes." She stirred slightly, making a small sound of distress, but remained unconscious. Benjamin's mind raced with terrible possibilities. Had she hit her head? Was it her heart? The stress of the past weeks catching up with her? The chickens clucked and pecked at the scattered feed around them, oblivious to the fear gripping Benjamin's heart. He gathered Camilla closer, feeling the faint flutter of her pulse against his fingers. "Lord, please," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Not again. Don't take her from me, too." The morning sun continued to rise over the mountains, casting long shadows across the yard where Benjamin knelt in the dirt, holding his unconscious wife and praying with all his might. The peace of the past 3 days shattered like glass, leaving only the sharp edges of fear behind. Benjamin's horse thundered down the mountain trail, hooves throwing mud in all directions as the rain poured mercilessly from leaden skies. His coat was soaked through, but he barely noticed the cold. His mind stayed fixed on Camilla, lying pale and still in their bed, attended only by prayer and hope. The usually half-day ride into Larkspur became a brutal test of endurance. Twice his horse nearly lost footing on the slick trail, and Benjamin's heart seized at each stumble. He couldn't afford a fall, not with Camilla's life hanging by a thread. The rain beat against his face like tiny needles, but he pressed on, muttering prayers between clenched teeth. "Faster," he urged his mount, though the poor beast was already giving its all. "Lord, just let me find the doctor." The town materialized through the curtain of rain like a ghost, buildings hunched against the downpour. Benjamin rode straight to Dr. Ellison's office, his horse's hooves clattering on the wooden sidewalk. He practically fell from the saddle, his legs numb from hours of hard riding. He pounded on the door, not caring about the proper way of things. "Dr. Ellison, please." The door opened to reveal the physician, spectacles fogged from the steam of a cup of tea in his hand. His eyes widened at the sight of Benjamin, water streaming from his beard and desperation etched on his face. "It's my wife," Benjamin gasped. "Camilla, she collapsed this morning. Won't wake proper, please." Dr. Ellison's professional calm took over. He set down his tea and reached for his medical bag. "Let me saddle my horse. Tell me her symptoms while I prepare." Benjamin described Camilla's collapse, her pallor, the shallow breathing as he helped the doctor ready his mount. His hands shook as he tightened the cinch, but his voice remained steady. Years of mountain living had taught him that panic helped no one. "When did she last eat?" Dr. Ellison asked, securing his bag to the saddle. "Last night. Rabbit stew. She seemed fine then, just a bit tired." The doctor nodded, mounting his horse with the practiced ease of a man used to urgent calls. "Lead on, Mr. Creed. We'll see what can be done." The return journey seemed to take forever, though Benjamin knew they were making good time despite the weather. The rain continued its assault, turning the world into a gray blur of water and worry. Dr. Ellison followed close behind, his horse picking its way carefully along the treacherous path. Night had fallen by the time they reached the cabin, the windows glowing with lamplight Benjamin had left burning. He helped the doctor dismount and led him inside, his heart pounding with fear of what they might find. Camilla lay just as he'd left her, pale as milk against the quilts, her breathing shallow but regular. Benjamin had propped her up with pillows and kept her warm, remembering how she'd tended him through a fever last month. Dr. Ellison set to work immediately, his movements efficient and gentle. He checked her pulse, listened to her breathing, felt her forehead for fever. Benjamin hovered nearby, hardly daring to breathe as he watched the doctor's face for any sign of the diagnosis. "Her pulse is weak," Dr. Ellison murmured, "but steady." He continued his examination, asking Benjamin questions about her recent health, their diet, any changes in routine. The hour that followed was one of the longest in Benjamin's life. He answered the doctor's questions, fetched water when asked, and prayed silently, his eyes never leaving Camilla's face. The rain drummed on the roof, marking time like a worried heartbeat. Finally, Dr. Ellison straightened up, an odd expression crossing his weathered features. He checked Camilla's pulse one more time, then turned to Benjamin with something like wonder in his eyes. "Mr. Creed," he said softly, "your wife is with child." Benjamin's legs gave way, and he sank into the chair beside the bed. His mouth opened, but no words came out. It wasn't possible. Camilla had told him she couldn't bear children. The town had mocked her for it. And yet, a weak voice from the bed drew both men's attention. "That can't be," Camilla whispered, her eyes fluttering open. Dr. Ellison's smile was gentle as morning light. "Seems the Lord disagrees, Mrs. Creed." He patted her hand. "The weakness you're experiencing is not uncommon in early pregnancy, especially given your recent fasting. You'll need plenty of rest and good food. No more skipping meals, mind you." Camilla's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Benjamin. He could only stare back, his own vision blurring as the magnitude of this miracle washed over him. The doctor spent the night in their spare room, wanting to ensure Camilla's condition remained stable. Benjamin didn't sleep, keeping vigil by her bedside, her small hand clasped in his large one. He prayed continuously, tears flowing freely into his beard, thankful beyond words for this blessing he'd never dared to hope for. As dawn approached, the rain began to ease. Dr. Ellison prepared to leave, writing out detailed instructions for Camilla's care and promising to return in a week to check on her progress. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said as he mounted his horse. "I've seen it time and again in my practice. Sometimes the greatest miracles come to those who've given up hoping for them." Benjamin nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He watched the doctor ride away, then returned to Camilla's bedside. She was sleeping peacefully now, some color returned to her cheeks. He sat beside her, taking her hand once more, and bowed his head in prayer. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "for this miracle, for this woman, for your endless grace." A shaft of morning sunlight suddenly broke through the clouds, streaming through the window to fall across their joined hands. Benjamin looked up, drawn by some instinct to glance outside. There, arching across the newly washed sky above the ridge, stretched not one but two perfect rainbows, their colors vibrant against the retreating storm clouds. The sight took his breath away. He'd seen many rainbows in his years on the mountain, but never a double one, and never one so bright. Camilla stirred, her eyes opening to catch the magnificent sight. "Oh," she breathed, squeezing his hand. "Benjamin, look." "I see it," he said softly, helping her sit up slightly so she could see better. "I reckon that's the Lord's way of signing his work." They watched together as the rainbows remained steadfast in the clearing sky, a testament to promises kept and prayers answered. Benjamin felt the truth of it deep in his bones. This was more than just a natural phenomenon. This was a sign of divine grace, as clear as the writing in his beloved Bible. The mountain air smelled clean and new, like the beginning of something wonderful. In their bed, Camilla rested her free hand on her stomach, wonder dawning in her eyes as she contemplated the miracle growing within. Benjamin watched her, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. The days following Dr. Ellison's visit moved like honey dripping from a spoon, slow, sweet, and precious. Benjamin tended to Camilla with the gentle reverence of a man who had been given a second chance at joy. He transformed their cabin into a sanctuary of care, his large hands now turned to tasks he'd never imagined himself doing. Each morning, he rose before dawn to kindle the fire and prepare breakfast. He'd learned to make passable biscuits and gravy, though his first attempts had been nearly hard enough to break teeth. Camilla would wake to find a tray beside the bed, steam rising from a cup of mint tea. Her stomach couldn't handle coffee anymore. "You don't have to wait on me hand and foot," she protested one morning, trying to sit up. Benjamin's weathered face creased with concern. "Doc said rest, and rest you shall." He adjusted her pillows with careful attention. "Besides," he added softly, Caring for you gives me purpose." During the long hours of her recovery, Benjamin discovered new depths to his patience. He read to her from his old Bible, his deep voice giving weight to the ancient words. The Psalms became their favorite, speaking as they did of providence and unexpected blessings. "Read the 23rd again," Camilla would often request, her eyes closed as she listened. Benjamin never refused, knowing how the familiar words soothed her spirit. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the cabin's window, Benjamin noticed Camilla struggling with her long hair, which had become tangled during her bed rest. Without a word, he fetched her hairbrush and sat beside her. "May I?" he asked, his voice gruff with emotion. Camilla's eyes widened, but she nodded. With infinite care, Benjamin began working through the tangles, starting at the ends just as he'd once watched his mother do. The simple act brought tears to Camilla's eyes, not from pain, but from the tenderness of it. Yet, despite all his care, Camilla's fears ran deep. He would often find her with hands pressed to her still flat belly, her face twisted with worry. "What if—" she started one evening, but couldn't finish. Benjamin set aside his whittling and moved to sit beside her. "What troubles you, wife?" "What if I lose the baby?" The words tumbled out in a rush. "What if this is just the Lord's way of testing us? Or worse, what if the town was right about me all along, and I'm not fit to be a mother?" Benjamin took her trembling hands in his. "Now you listen here," he said firmly. "Grace doesn't ask permission to enter our lives. It just comes, like rain on dry ground." He touched her cheek gently. "And you're the most fertile soil for love I've ever known." Despite his reassurances, word of Camilla's condition spread through Larkspur like wildfire. Benjamin heard the whispers when he went to town for supplies, some scoffing, some wondering, some touched with awe. "That's the one who married Fat Camilla," he overheard one woman say to another outside the mercantile. "They say she's with child now." "Impossible," her companion replied. "Everyone knows she's barren as winter." Benjamin's hands tightened on the wagon reins, but he kept his peace. The Lord's answers needed no defense from him. Not all reactions were unkind. Old Mrs. Peterson, who had known Camilla since she was a girl, stopped Benjamin outside the feed store. "You tell that sweet child that some of us are praying for her," she said, pressing a small package of peppermint candy into his hand. The Lord's timing is his own. One bright morning, about 2 weeks into Camilla's recovery, they heard hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Benjamin stepped onto the porch, one hand near his rifle, but relaxed when he recognized Reverend Matthews riding up. The preacher dismounted with dignity, despite his advanced years. "Brother Creed," he called out, "news reached me of your blessing. I've come to offer prayers, if you'll have them." Benjamin glanced back through the doorway. Camilla had insisted on sitting in her rocking chair that morning, wrapped in quilts despite the warm day. She nodded slightly. "We'd be honored, Reverend," Benjamin replied, helping the older man up the steps. Inside, Reverend Matthews removed his hat and smiled warmly at Camilla. "Sister Creed," he said, "you're looking well." "I'm feeling stronger each day," she replied softly. The preacher pulled up a chair and opened his Bible. "The Lord has seen fit to bless this union," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority and joy. "Let us give thanks." As the Reverend prayed, Benjamin watched Camilla's face. Something shifted in her expression as the words washed over her. A softening. An acceptance. For the first time since learning of her condition, she smiled fully, one hand resting protectively over her belly. After the preacher left, Benjamin insisted Camilla rest, but she shook her head. "Help me onto the porch," she requested. "I need to see the mountains. He wrapped her in a shawl and carried her to the rocking chair outside. The afternoon light painted the peaks in shades of gold and purple, while in the meadow below their cabin, a family of deer emerged from the tree line. "Look," Camilla whispered, pointing to a doe with 2 young fawns. "She's teaching them where to find the sweetest grass." Benjamin stood behind her chair, his large hands resting on her shoulders. "Every creature knows its purpose," he said softly, "just as we're learning ours." They watched in companionable silence as the deer grazed their way across the meadow. The peace of the moment settled over them like a blessing, and Benjamin felt Camilla relax under his hands. "I think I understand now," she said after a while, her voice thoughtful. "What's that?" "Why the Lord brought us together." She reached up to cover one of his hands with hers. "Not just for the land or for comfort, but for this, for new life." Benjamin squeezed her shoulder gently. "For healing, too, I reckon. Both of us needed it." The sun continued its slow descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors. The deer moved on, disappearing back into the forest shadows, but Camilla and Benjamin remained on the porch, watching darkness settle over their land. "Benjamin?" Camilla's voice was drowsy with contentment. "Would you read to me again? The 23rd Psalm?" He smiled, retrieving his Bible from inside. Settling into the chair beside her, he began to read, his deep voice merging with the evening sounds of the mountain, the wind in the pines, the distant call of a whippoorwill, the soft creaking of Camilla's rocking chair. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." As the familiar words filled the gathering dusk, Camilla closed her eyes, one hand still resting on her belly. The peace that passed understanding had finally found its way into her heart, replacing fear with faith, shame with dignity, and doubt with quiet certainty. The August sun beat down mercilessly as Benjamin guided their wagon down the winding mountain trail toward Larkspur. Camilla sat beside him, one hand resting protectively over her growing belly, while the other gripped the wooden seat. Her condition was now visible to anyone who looked, the gentle swell of new life impossible to hide beneath her simple dress. "You didn't have to come," Benjamin said softly, noting how she braced herself against each bump in the road. "Yes, I did." Her voice carried quiet determination. "We face this together." They had spotted the railroad men approaching their cabin that morning, their dark suits stark against the mountain greenery. This time they carried official-looking papers and spoke of eminent domain and government authority. Benjamin had cut them off mid-speech, telling them to meet him at the Larkspur courthouse in 2 hours. Now, as their wagon rolled into town, Benjamin felt the weight of stares. Shopkeepers paused in their doorways. Women whispered behind raised hands. Children stopped their play to point. But these weren't the cruel looks of months past. Something had shifted. The courthouse stood stern and square in the morning light, its weather-worn boards a testament to frontier justice. Benjamin helped Camilla down from the wagon, his strong hands steady at her waist. She straightened her shawl and lifted her chin, ready to face whatever came. Inside, the railroad agent sat behind a borrowed desk, flanked by 2 companions in expensive suits. A small crowd of townspeople had gathered, drawn by the prospect of drama. Benjamin recognized faces that had once sneered at Camilla, Mrs. Peterson from the general store, the blacksmith's wife, even the preacher's daughter who had started those cruel rumors. "Mr. Creed," the agent began formally, "we have orders to—" "Here's my marriage certificate," Benjamin interrupted, laying the document on the desk. "Dated months before your first visit." His voice carried across the room, steady and sure. And here's sworn testimony from Reverend Matthews about our union." The agent picked up the papers, adjusting his spectacles. One of his companions leaned forward, frowning. "Marriage of convenience won't hold up. We need proof of a genuine homestead, a real family working the land." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. Benjamin felt Camilla tense beside him, but before he could speak, another voice rang out. "That man carried my herbs through 2 feet of snow when my grandson was sick." Mrs. Peterson stepped forward, her aged voice strong. "His wife, yes, his true wife, made the poultice that broke the fever. They're as real as any family in this valley." The blacksmith's wife joined in. "I've seen them at market together. She sells bread now, best I've ever tasted. They work that land as one." More voices added to the chorus. The miller speaking of Benjamin's fair trades, the storekeeper describing Camilla's careful bookkeeping. Even the preacher's daughter stepped forward, shame coloring her cheeks. "And she's with child," she added softly. "Anyone can see the Lord's blessed their union." The agent glanced at Camilla's visible pregnancy, then back at his papers. The room fell silent, holding its breath. Finally, he picked up his stamp and pressed it firmly to the document. "Homestead confirmed," he declared. "The railway will adjust its route." A collective sigh swept through the room. Benjamin felt Camilla's hand slip into his, squeezing tight. The railroad men gathered their papers and left without another word, their fancy suits already dusty from frontier justice. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the mountains. Benjamin helped Camilla back into the wagon, noting how the same townspeople who had gathered to witness now smiled and nodded in respect. Mrs. Peterson hurried over with a package of peppermint candy. The preacher's daughter approached hesitantly to offer congratulations. As they drove out of town, the setting sun painted the peaks in shades of crimson and gold. The mountain air grew cool, carrying the scent of pine and late summer sage. Benjamin guided the horses steadily homeward, his heart full of quiet triumph. Beside him, Camilla sat straight and proud, her face glowing in the evening light. Benjamin glanced at her, marveling at how this woman had helped him transform a lonely cabin into a true home. He took her hand gently in his. "We're a family, Camilla," he said softly. "That's what the mountain needed to see." She smiled, understanding all that remained unspoken between them. How far they'd come from that bitter winter night, how grace had led them both to healing. The wagon rolled on toward home, while behind them the sunset set the mountains ablaze with light, as if heaven itself were celebrating their victory. Autumn painted the mountains in amber and gold, shortening the days as winter crept closer. Benjamin worked late into the evenings, the steady rasp of his plane against cedar wood joining the crackle of the hearth fire. The cradle was taking shape, each curve and joint crafted with devotion. Camilla watched from her rocking chair, her hands resting on her full belly. The scent of cedar shavings mingled with wood smoke, creating a perfume unique to their home. She had grown large with child, yet carried herself with a grace that made Benjamin's heart ache with gratitude. "Almost finished," he said, running his hand along the smooth rail. "Just needs the rockers shaped proper." Snow began to fall outside their window, the first real storm of the season. Camilla opened her worn Bible, finding comfort in familiar words. Her voice, steady and clear, filled their cabin with Isaiah's ancient promise. "To give unto them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness." The labor pains began as evening settled in. Benjamin paced while the midwife he'd fetched from town tended to Camilla. Hours passed like years until finally a new sound pierced the mountain quiet. Their son's first cry, strong and defiant. "A boy," the midwife announced, wrapping the infant in clean linen. "Healthy as a spring colt." Benjamin stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sight of his son's tiny face. Tears flowed freely into his beard as he knelt beside the bed, clasping Camilla's hand. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered hoarsely. "Thank you." The midwife cleaned up and left them alone, promising to return the next day. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their mountain in pristine white. Inside, the lamp cast a gentle glow as Benjamin settled into the chair beside their bed, watching his wife and son. Camilla's eyes shone with joy as she cradled their baby, counting his fingers and toes for the 10th time. Her face, though tired, radiated peace, the peace of a woman who had finally found her place in the world. Later that night, as the lamp burned low and their son slept soundly in his new cedar cradle, Benjamin leaned close to his wife. "You said you couldn't have a child," he whispered, touching their son's tiny hand. "Turns out the mountain just needed spring." Camilla smiled through fresh tears, reaching out to draw their sleeping infant closer. The miracle of his existence seemed to fill every corner of their cabin with light. Beyond their walls, the wind whispered through the pines, no longer the lonely sound that had haunted Benjamin's solitude, but a gentle lullaby promising new beginnings. Their son stirred, making small noises in his sleep. Benjamin adjusted the quilt around him, his rough hands impossibly gentle. Together they watched their child dream, while outside the mountain kept its silent vigil, guardian to their hard-won happiness. The fire popped softly in the hearth, sending shadows dancing across the cedar cradle. In that moment, their cabin held everything they'd never dared to hope for: love, family, and the grace of second chances. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.